with you, please turn to 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 9. You may stand when you find your place. Second Peter 3:9. But, beloved, 3 and 9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering towards us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. If you could bless the sermon, please, Pastor.
Father, we're thankful for your word this morning. We look forward, Lord, to hearing your word preached, Lord. It's food for our souls, Lord. And I just pray for great anointing for our brother John this morning. I pray that you would be with him, giving the words to speak, Lord, that will just lift us up, encourage us, and give us the strength that we need to follow you. So just have your way in this message, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. You may all be seated. As Pastor mentioned last week, we are preaching through the final days of Christ in preparation for the coming Easter season. He preached on the timing of Jesus' death and resurrection last week. And today I will be discussing Christ in court, our Savior taken before both the high priests of Israel as well as Pontius Pilate. Some very familiar and well-known Christian imagery. The scene of Jesus before the masses shouting, "Crucify him," I believe is one familiar with all of us. But I've done something a little different this day. In preparation for this, I have read through the account of Jesus before Pilate in all four Gospels, and have noticed a couple differences. Some of the books have different accounts, and some of the books have different descriptions of the same account. There's information in Matthew that isn't in Luke, and information in Luke that isn't in Matthew. So to kind of get the best possible view of what exactly is happening here, I've gone through all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and taken all the verses from them and done my best to put them together into a single narrative. The downside of this is that it's going to make it almost impossible to follow along with me, as I will be jumping back and forth between all four books. And it pretty much occurred to me about 5 minutes ago, hey, that's why we have the scriptures up on the screen, so we can follow along. Did not do that. So I hope you will bear with me, and you may just have to look this up on YouTube after the fact and slow it down. We will begin in the book of John, chapter 18, with verse 12. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him, and led him away to Ananias first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Right off the bat, something should smell fishy here, as Jesus is not only taken prisoner in middle of the night, but he is immediately dragged off to not the courts or jail or anything like that, but to the father-in-law of the current high priest. This just stinks of a mafia Gestapo type deal. Just someone disappearing in middle of the night so he could be taken back to the family home. It's extremely sketchy. And we must remember that this is the church doing this. We may complain about corruption in our churches nowadays, but at least to the extent of my knowledge, we don't really disappear people in middle of the night much. So we can congratulate ourselves on that, I suppose. To move on to the book of Luke, chapter 22 and verse 63. And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And many other blasphemously spake they against him. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, ye will not believe. And this immediately is where the timeline gets a little complicated. Because in Matthew and Mark, the events are described as Jesus is taken before the high priest, and once he annoys them enough with his blasphemy, they start beating him. But in Luke, they take him to the high priest, they beat him, and then they question him. The best I can come up with is that Jesus is taken prisoner, and he is taken to the high priest's house, the father-in-law's house, where he is questioned and then beaten, and then he goes before the other high priests. An alternative possibility would be that he is taken to the high priest's house, beaten, to the other high priests and questioned, and then beaten again, which does seem possible, because this is an extremely petty treatment of Jesus here. They blindfold him and just shove him around, asking him to prophesy who pushed him. That is just childish. So they're clearly not above beating him up twice, but because all three Gospels describe it in the exact same manner, I assume you get tired of blindfolding someone and pushing him over eventually. I'm inclined to think it only happened once, and probably between the two groups of Jews. That's just my own personal theory, however. Verse 67, And Christ said unto them, If I tell you, ye will not believe. And if I also ask you, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. John chapter 18, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Fairly straightforward. The high priest is trying to throw his weight around and intimidate Jesus. It's not working. Mark chapter 14, verse 55. And the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. And that's interesting to me, because they clearly don't care about a fair trial. They kidnapped him in the middle of the night and have already been beating him. But that was the actions of the chief high priest, the numero uno guy, a man by the name of Caiaphas, who I've heard about him before, a historian talking about him and some of the details of his life. But that was on the radio, and I have not researched it myself, so I'm not going to quote him until I can fact-check that. But we do know something about this council Jesus is before right now, namely that it includes members sympathetic to Christ. We know Joseph of Arimathea, I'm not pronouncing that right, was on the council, and we also know that Nicodemus was probably there. Two men who were closeted Christians. So they did have to at least make a show trial to try to find something they can get Jesus on. So verse 56, For many bear false witness against him, but their witnesses agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witnesses agree together. So they're trying to get him on terrorism, more or less, and they just can't find people who can lie well enough to get their story straight. Matthew 26, verse 62. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Luke 22, verse 70, Then said they all, Art thou then the Son of God? And he said unto them, Ye say that I am. Mark 14, verse 63, Then the high priest rent his clothes, and saith, What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. I also kind of skip around between books depending on which one I like the wording of better, so that's not helping anything, I admit. So John chapter 18, verse 28, I'll give you a head start on that one. The priests have been convinced of Jesus' guiltiness of his blasphemy against God, so they're going to go to the higher authority, they think, in this matter, since the Jews are a subject people to the Roman Empire, so the Romans get nervous when they execute people without the Romans' permission, so they got to clear this through the proper channels. Plus, we know that the general populace was generally more favorable towards Christ, which makes sense if the church does things like kidnap people in the middle of the night. So they want everything straight and legal on this before they continue to move. So verse 28, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled. Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? Why are you waking me up at 6 in the morning for this? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up to thee. It's not a very good legal defense. I don't think that one would hold up in court. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. So the Jews are once again employing someone else to do their dirty work for them. They won't accept Judas's blood money for betraying Christ in the first place, and here they won't even have the gall to put Jesus to death themselves. So to just continue in the same chapter, Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it to thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. That is a maddeningly unclear answer that does not explain anything to Pilate, I am sorry to say. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into this world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he had said thus, he went out again unto the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. I wonder if this is Pilate saying, This man is innocent, or if this is Pilate saying, I have no idea what either of you are talking about. I am not a Jew. I am your heathen, pagan local governor. I cannot make heads or tails out of what this is you are bringing before me. Go away. But the high priests are not ones to give up so easily. Luke 23, verse 2, And they began to accuse him, being Jesus, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. Mark 15, verse 3, And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Yeah, you guys are talking about not paying taxes. Now I'm concerned. Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Luke 23, verse 5. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teacheth throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. Yep.
Galilean.
Yeah, that didn't sound right. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at the time. Your problem. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him for a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. So the technical king of the Jews, the political leader, sees this Jesus, this miracle worker, who is going around the countryside gathering followers, supposedly to overthrow Rome, which is apparently what everyone on both sides of the aisle thought Christ was about. And Jesus is brought before Herod, and it says he and his men of war counted him as nothing. The soldiers, the big tough guys of the area, takes one look at Jesus and pretty much dismisses him as just, this is not an insurrectionist leader. So you can have him back, Pilate, and deal with this. So, Mark 15, verse 6. Pilate is back in custody of Jesus now. And now at the feast, he, Pilate, released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. Matthew 27 and 19. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. So Pilate's own wife warns him against having anything to do with the execution of the Christ. A prophetic dream, most likely. It's interesting. Luke 23 and verse 14. And he, Pilate, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man, touching those things whereof ye accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Mark 15 and verse 10, For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. Luke 23 and 18, And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas. We would rather have this guy who was actually trying to start a revolution, rather than this Jesus. Mark 15 and verse 12, And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him, who you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. John 19, I'm pretty much going to skim over this, because it's kind of lengthy and it's easy to summarize. Pilate took Jesus back with him. He had him scourged. This is where the soldiers place a crown of thorns on his head. They whip him, they beat him, etc. But to go down to verse 9, And they went again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? And Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. So that goes back and forth for a while. Pilate does everything he can to convince the Jews that Jesus deserves to be freed, but he's ultimately unsuccessful. Matthew 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, rather a fuss was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. John 19, verse 16. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. I have always been prone to viewing Pilate in a more forgiving light than I have the high priests. Which is interesting considering he was a Roman governor, he was an oppressor of these people, and he was most likely an active heretic, a pagan believer in the not-so-mysterious religion of Rome, which was messy, to say the least. And yet, he seems to have picked up on who Jesus is, at least to a greater extent than Caiaphas and company did. And really, there is a lot we can take from these passages of scriptures. The big takeaway, I think, is the image of Jesus standing there, suffering all this torment without ever once complaining, and very rarely even defending himself. This is, of course, a good example to us for when we inevitably are attacked for our faith. It is generally in a much less violent way than this, but Jesus is, of course, a very good role model for our own behavior and actions. I don't think we should try to copy him here, however, for the first and very obvious reason that we are not Jesus. We cannot do what he did. There is the saying, what would Jesus do? I am inclined to think that is something of an inaccurate statement, as we are not divine and cannot know everything, so we will never be able to pull off what Jesus did. But we do have the very same spirit that guided and directed Jesus. Well, one more passage of scripture, Matthew 10, 16 and 20. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as a serpent and as harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. A little prophetic for his own life there. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you should speak. For it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. So Jesus pretty much promises his disciples, and I think by extension us, that we don't need to worry too much about what we're going to say in defense of God, because God can, for the most part, defend himself. He will give us the words to speak when we need them. I think a good example of that is Stephen the martyr, who was apparently led so much by the Spirit that he appeared as an angel to the people actively executing him. That is, of course, not to say don't prepare a sermon. I think that's obviously not the moral I should go with today. And I think the Apostle Paul is a good example of that, as he used the legal system of Rome to get out of trouble with the Jews more than once. So I definitely think that is acceptable to do. Really, to go back to Jesus, I don't think we... the other big reason why I don't think we should copy his actions in the courts of the Jews is that he was not trying to escape. That's fairly obvious. Jesus' desired end result for these trials was to be convicted and be guilty, so he could go to the cross and sacrifice himself for us. That's the entire idea of the Easter message. So he doesn't need Matlock here. He needs Barney Fife to handle his defense. He's not trying to get out. So that's not what we want to do. So the interesting part of this, the part that sticks out to me, is not that Jesus was silent for most of this, not that he didn't defend himself for most of it, but that he did at all. That he did occasionally give an answer to the high priest, or did occasionally try to explain what was going on to Pilate. He was not entirely silent throughout this. And I think the reason for that, the reason he would still give some explanation of what he was doing, can be found in 2 Peter 3 and 9, or in the scripture that I just read. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. Jesus is still witnessing. He is still performing his Father's work, even while he is on death's row, being tried and beaten in preparation for Calvary. Even in his last moments, he is still doing his best to save the unbelievers, even the high priests who are condemning him in the first place, and the pagan governor Pilate. And wow, it is weird and wobbly in here when I just took my glasses off. So in conclusion this morning, I do think we should follow the precept of what would Jesus do, but in spirit, that even when we are being actively tried for our faith and beliefs, that we should still do our best to witness to everyone, including the very people who are putting us on trial to begin with. Pastor?